I just wanted to take the chair's prerogative and ask you the first question,
yes,
if I could, Neil. And just to touch on that last point you made, I scribbled down what the Secretary of State said in the Q&As today on trade and standards, which for me, I think was actually almost further than he may even have gone previously. He said something along the lines, this is probably inaccurate, but I think he said we won't be signing trade deals that mean British producers are undercut on animal welfare or environmental standards. So a very clear signal, I think, that he would expect to use trade policy or trade deals to prevent products produced to different standards to our own coming into the country under the terms of a trade deal, of course, not necessarily under the terms of trade within WTO. Now, that I think is interesting. To what extent do you think that is shared amongst his cabinet colleagues?
Yeah, I mean, it's not shared by all of them by any means, and I think, but I actually think the Prime Minister is keen to make sure that there is a British agriculture and food production into the future. So in some ways, you know, government works, as both Angela and I know, right from the top downwards, basically. And if you've got the Prime Minister who's saying, right, OK, let's actually make sure we've got a sustainable agriculture, then I think we are fine. I mean, the nature of this is that, don't forget, you know, Michael Gove is Secretary of State for DEFRA now. Will he be Secretary of State for DEFRA when these decisions are being made? But I think what he's doing, and then I think what we will do as a select committee and what you will do as the NFU, is you will take all these words, you will write them down and make sure you reiterate them to government. Because it is, you know, I am worried in the end, you know, I mean, I make a sort of slightly facetious when, you know, if the last deal with the Americans is over the chlorinated chicken, you know, will it hold? And I think that's the one that worries us. Now, I think we've got to concentrate at the moment on getting a deal with Europe, whatever shape or form it takes. And these deals with America, with China, with India, probably Australia, New Zealand, they are at least 5 years away. I suspect more than that. But, you know, even being optimistic. So I'm not saying they shouldn't be scrutinised, but what we want to do now is not take our eye off this particular ball, and that is, let's get a deal with Europe, like it or lump it, and get that done, and then look at these other deals, and then we'll hold the government to account. But I think, you know, welfare is important, especially, you know, we've already got high welfare standards in this country. If you're going to be asked for even higher ones, then you can't be expected then to compete with low quality product coming in under lower welfare standards, because there will be people, whether we like it or not, and some of them haven't got the money, so you can't blame them. They will buy the cheapest they can get in the shops. Others, you know, it's a choice for them, but they still choose to buy the cheapest. And so, you know, that's where I think more people are keen to have a higher welfare standards, more people are paying more for it, but it's still bridging that gap. I don't know, Andrew, I heard you muttering there. No.
Neil and I have history. We don't often fall out. But no, I mean, to answer the question directly, it means being, if Neil doesn't mind, answering a very political question. So I'm completely signed up to this report, which I think is very sensible and provides a really good evidence base for what to happen in order to make sure that agriculture farming has a prosperous future in this country. But to answer the question, as far as I'm concerned, if Theresa May were to stand up and tell us exactly what she does want from a deal and provide some leadership on it, I think she'd be surprised to find that a significant majority of her own MPs would fall in behind her. And we're in despair in Parliament. Absolute despair, because we think that that's exactly what's lacking at the moment. We do need that certainty. We need a sense of direction in terms of where we want to go. Now, look, I'll be very open with you. I'm a Remainer. I'd stay in the single market and the customs union. That's what I want to see. But let's just have something from Theresa May to tell us the direction that she wants us to go in. And I think for as long as she doesn't do that, she's going to continue with the division and the difficulties within her cabinet. And I know there are party problems there. I mean, we've both got problems in our parties, let's face it. Massively so, but in my case, possibly terminal. But please don't quote that.
You can see why Angela and I get on. We both have a very direct approach to life.
Exactly.
So, but you make an interesting point. I mean, basically, it's doing a negotiation at the moment is difficult because naturally, if you say you must have access to the single market, you must have access to the customs union, then it makes it more difficult and more expensive to get that deal. But I think what we do want is clarity, and I don't mind whether it's in the customs union, in the single market, or it's a bespoke deal. But like I said, I think the issue now is we do need to actually know what it is. Mirig, I can see Mirig down the end there. He was making the point this morning, 13 months now to the time we leave the EU. We do need to know, and all of you, if you're going to invest, you need to know, don't you? That's the key to it.
Right, okay. Let's throw it open to questions. There are a couple of microphones roving around. If you stick your hands up, we'll take a couple at a time. If you can let me know your name and where you come from as you ask the question, that would be helpful. Thank you. Yes, so one red here, and let's have the check shirt there.
Hi, thanks for your presentations. I'm Dan Leonard from the northwest, from Cheshire, Shropshire area. In the impact assessments, obviously there's a lot of concern about imported food from non-EU countries suppressing prices in the sectors as you described there. I'm just interested that the rest of the world have got faster growing economies and very changing economies. They're becoming more aspiring type of people living in those economies who are looking for higher quality produce. And in those impact assessments, has anybody dared to consider that there might be an appetite for the high quality food and produce that we have in the UK and put that into the impact assessment as well? Because I'm looking for more positivity and championing what we do in the UK, and hearing more about marketing the hard work that's done by the people at this conference, and looking to get into those faster growing large economies that are looking for that high quality food.
Yeah, I mean, we'll take
one more. Yes.
Simon Robinson from Hampshire. I've got a fair amount of experience of negotiating agreements, and the more I hear and the more I see today and in the past, and the scope and breadth of this discussion, even with the EU, which is an extremely, ought to be easy because we've got no tariffs at the moment, but is actually rather a hostile partner in many respects. I've got to say, 29th of March next year, we're going to crash out with no deal. I just don't see it happening, I'm afraid. And I want to know whether the committee thinks the government should be doing something to prepare for a no deal, because that's the one thing I don't hear anything about.
Right, okay. First of all, on I was talking to the AHDB and the Prime Minister during a recent visit to China. We finally got agreement now for them to start taking British beef again. We've been going on now for nearly 20 years. So, because naturally the Chinese, especially the better off Chinese, they like pork and chicken, but they're also looking for something different in the shape of beef. So I think there are lots of markets there, and to answer your question directly, I think they're complementary, and I think we've got to drive for them. But do I think they're going to immediately take over from the European market overnight? I don't think they do. So what we need to do is get some access and keep some access to that EU market, but not take our eye off the ball about promoting those markets across the rest of the world, with Asia in particular, because that's where the economies are growing. And so I think the combination of the two is right. So yes, there is some positives, and once we can get to make the freedom to have these deals, they've got, but it will always, I suspect, and where you've hit the nail on the head, it will always be on the higher end of the market, naturally not the lower end of the market, because our costs, our welfare, all of the things we do will make our product more. But I think brand Britain in the long run is good, and we can make more of it. So I'm not trying to be negative, but I think let's be realistic. We've got a big market where 60% of our food exports and imports go in and out of through the European Union. We and they will want access to it. And to answer your question, I had sort of 10 years in the European Parliament. The Europeans will not want to give us a better deal out than in. So, but will they ultimately want to punish us too much because they punish themselves at the same time? We are still some 13% of the total consuming market across the whole of the European Union. I shouldn't say this as doing an air quality, but I'm a bit of a petrol head, and I was reading the Auto Trader, and I started adding up the number of new cars that were sold in 17. And if you add Skoda and Seat into Volkswagen, because that's what they and German owned, 40% of our car market last year in 2017 was German. Now, do you believe that the Germans are going to give away a market that size, right, by being too bloody awkward? So I think we will get a deal. It may not be a brilliant one, but I think it'll be a workable one. But I think the second part of your answer is yes, the committee's going over to see Claire Moriarty, who's the permanent secretary of EFRA. They are taking on more staff. We need to know what they're doing, and we need to know that they are actually preparing for the scenario of if there is no deal on the table. The interesting point that Michael Gove gave this morning, I thought he was almost hinting that there might be a slightly longer interim deal. Now, whether he knows that or whether he doesn't, I don't know. But like I said, I just think probably in reality, that's the best thing we can get by March next year. Angela.
Can I just say on promoting British food and exporting British food, I thought one of the really interesting things that Gove said this morning. One of the really interesting focuses that he made was on innovation and the need for investment in innovation, because actually improving productivity in the food and farming sector is one of the best means of ensuring that we build a healthy export base for our produce. So I think that's because we become more cost effective. So I think that's something that we really need to hold Gove's feet to the fire about, because actually that is really important. But if we're going to deliver investment in innovation and in agriculture farming, then we will have to make sure that there's certainty in terms of our future. So it's back to that earlier point that I made. We need certainty. It's in this report. We need certainty so that there is confidence out there to invest in food and farming. It's critically important. And just on no deal, very quickly, it scares the pants off me, frankly, no deal. It really does. It absolutely terrifies me. And it's not just food and farming, the chemicals industry. I'm chair of the all-party group for chemicals industries, chemicals, automotive, aerospace, the city, all the way across the economy. There is real trepidation, real fear of a no-deal scenario materialising. And I think you'll see Parliament getting increasingly focused on it if it becomes obvious that we're not going to get a deal. And I think we'll know by late summer, early autumn. Whether or not they're preparing for it is something we would find very hard to establish, because government is incredibly secretive about the whole Brexit process.
Just going back to China, the Danish have got 20 people over there promoting Danish pork in particular. Yeah. We've got one. Yeah, so we really are going to have to up our game. I also think it's probably maybe a role possibly for the House of Lords, because the trouble with us is parliamentarians, especially with a no majority, no minister can go off to China for more than 5 minutes before they're called back to vote again. You've got to actually make sure with China that you've got people of status and you've got people that are there for a long time as well. And I think that's where the House of Lords could be quite useful, because the Chinese, naturally, once you become a leader in China, until they bury you, you're there for life, aren't you? And they can't quite see with sort of Western powers why the ministers change all the time. And so I think it's continuity that matters, and I think that could work.
Great, good stuff. Good to know you're looking for a use for the House of Lords.
That's right. That's right.
Right, we've got two questions on this side, David and then Tim.
David Exwood, West Sussex Farmer. You make mention of IT systems to cover our trade with Europe in your report. Isn't the truth is there is no IT system in the world, and even if there was one, the ability of any government to deliver it that will cover the level and nature of trade that we have with Europe? And would you not, as a committee, be doing the government and the country a great service by pointing this out?
And Tim.
Yeah.
Good point.
Tim Brightman, the CLA president, more importantly, a cereals farmer from my point of view. Neil, I think you've answered my first question, but I would ask you to use your European experience to persuade the colleagues that you have who can really influence this of just how hacked off the Europeans are. I've spent 4 years in Europe, chairing the European Landowners Policy Group, and mark my word, they want to give us a much, much worse deal. And I don't think your cabinet colleagues really understand, the cabinet really understand just how much we're going to have to give way when it comes to free access and regulatory convergence to make sure that the Europeans really do think of only 16% of their exports that come across to our country. Because there's a lot of talk about in Germany it actually being looked for in different markets. And so I would really, really ask that you try and get that point across to them, because otherwise my fear is like Simon, we are heading to the door. And then when there's no chicken for Kentucky Fried Chicken at half term, they're not going to be happy with a no deal.
Very good point.
IT systems.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say to you with the IT system, why I think it's possible, and I don't say it can be delivered, but don't forget, as we leave the European Union, our rules are completely the same. And so therefore, it should be possible to do a bespoke agreement. We may well have to largely stick to the same rules as we've got now for trade, but don't forget, if we're going to trade into the European Union anyway, if you're a company, you will trade under those European rules anyway. So therefore, I think it is possible to do. Whether government can deliver it or not, that's for you to decide. And I think the jury is open on that. I think your answer to whether the Europeans are, their attitude, and I can understand, and I think, naturally they are very disappointed, many, because we've left, and they feel that they've been hurt by the fact that we've left. The trouble is, you then got to balance that with a referendum that took place in this country, and it doesn't, I was a Remainer as well, but it doesn't matter which side of the argument you were on. In the end, it was a higher percentage of people voted than in a general election, and they voted by a clear majority, not massive, but a clear majority, actually to leave the European Union. And so therefore, very difficult for us then to go back and say, well, of course, we must have it on the European terms, because I think there's part of the population out there who actually say, I better not swear in this audience, but, we've had enough of these Europeans, we're going anyway. And I think that is the balance. And I know, like I said, I understand Angela's position as far as the, party's concerned, but she would have mixed views in her party, very mixed views in mine as to how we leave the European Union. But my view is a pragmatic one, and is that we are leaving, but why hurt ourselves in the process? So where I agree with your tenor of your question is that let's try and get as good a deal as possible. I'm not convinced in the end. Don't forget, there's a lot of hard talk going on both sides at the moment. And yes, they're going to talk tough, but then so are we probably. And so in the end, that doesn't mean to say we won't get some sort of a deal. And I think what ideally, and I think hopefully will be on the table, is some sort of interim mechanism. The argument's going to be, with an interim deal, are we going to be able to then, during that interim period, be able to start negotiating our own free trade agreements? And do we, through the period of that interim deal, have to stick to all the rules within the single market and the customs union? And that's what the sticking point is at the moment, I suspect. And I suspect that's what the argument arguments will be, and we'll go to the wire. But I think we've got to deal. I try to deal with the realities not only of what the deal will be, but the realities of political life in this country. The decision was made by the British people at a higher percentage than at a general election. So very difficult for me as an elected politician to say you didn't make the right decision.
But the problem is, Neil, that I agree with Tim, and I think the problem is that the European Union 27, the EU 27, has determined that an economic price will be paid by the UK and by the 27 for Brexit. There will be a negative outcome, economic outcome on both sides, but that the political imperative is greater and is far more important to the EU 27. Given the populism and the instability that's characterising Europe at the moment, Western Europe, then I suspect that for the European Union, as I've said, the political imperative is the most important one. And in that sense, I think we ought to perhaps tread a little bit more carefully and perhaps be a little bit more conducive, in terms of making the necessary compromises. I mean, some of our positions are just not helping the situation around immigration, around, regulatory standards. I mean, it's not helping anything or anybody. And I agree with the Sussex farmer. I mean, actually, I'm happy, I keep saying this, more than happy with the report. If the report kicks off a debate about whether or not there is an IT system out there that can deliver effective customs arrangements, then I'm happy. Because, if there isn't one, then we need to know that sooner rather than later.
Right, we've got a couple of questions on this side of the room here, and yes, Jane.
James Black, I'm an arable and pig farmer in mid-Suffolk. Neil, thank you for the report. It's headed up that it was looking at how a potential trade deal could affect farmers and food processors and consumers. I'm just a little disappointed that you don't spend a bit more time looking at the whole aspect of indecision and the lack of direction that we've got. You've been in Europe. You know that deals in Europe are always 11th hour. I don't share your optimism with us knowing anything more by the summer. I think we will get to next March before we actually know anything. And I think that that's a disaster. And I'm just a little disappointed that your report doesn't actually highlight rather more the fact that we are living in this period of 2 years during which we just don't know what we're supposed to be doing. I keep attending different meetings looking at what Brexit's going to mean for my business, and I'm no further forward in understanding that today, or even having had the summary of your report or Gove speaking to conference this morning than I was 12 months ago. So, I believe that you should have held government's feet to the fire over the fact that this period of indecision and lack of movement is what is really going to hit the economy.
Okay, happy to answer that one.
And the second microphone, I think, is just there. Yeah.
Thank you. Sean Spears from Green Alliance and Green UK, which is a coalition of 13 environmental groups working on Brexit. And Neil Petrolhead, as I'll now call you. I was interested, you say that the priority is to get a trade deal with the EU, and then it'll be 5-7 years down the road before we have any chance of deals with other countries. But to get a deal with the EU, we will have to accept EU standards. And accepting EU standards will make it almost impossible to get a deal with lots of other countries, notably the United States. I wonder if firstly you accept that there are two sort of trading superpowers, the EU and the US, and you have to take one or other of their standards. And secondly, I wonder if you think that the reason that fringe figures like Jacob Rees-Mogg, but also possibly figures like the Foreign Secretary, Trade Secretary and so on, appear to prefer no deal is precisely because if you get the deal with the EU, it means it's impossible to get deals with other countries.
Right, should I On the first question I think it's probably a matter of balance for select committees to what degree we hold government's feet to the fire. I think what we do is we point out a lot of errors of their ways, we point out the problems the industry are going to have, and we ask them to get on with it. I think there's probably a limit to how far we go, but perhaps we haven't gone. Normally I'm not urged to go further. I'm usually told not to go so far as I normally do. So it's an interesting one for me to say we should have gone further, but I think it is a matter of balance, and I suppose we took that choice. But I don't necessarily disagree with some of your points that you make, but I think that's clear that I think the point on the question on the EU. I think the point I was making that any company that whether we're inside or outside the European Union, if you're trading food back into Europe or tractors, or not we make any tractors now, but cars or whatever, we will trade under single market rules, their trade rules, to get them back into Europe, whether we're in or outside of the European Union. That's not going to stop us doing a trade deal with America, because we will be outside and we will agree a separate deal. What we wouldn't necessarily be able to do would be bringing those American goods in and then trade them back into Europe, but we wouldn't be part of the single market. We wouldn't necessarily do that anyway. So I don't think it's impossible. I think if we're not careful, we are going to complicate lives too much for ourselves. And while I don't want Angela and I to have too much of a debate, but if you get two politicians together, you will. Somebody asked me just about my experiences of the European Union, and while I was a Remainer, I could understand why a lot of people voted to come out. Because you see, when David Cameron went over for a deal with Europe to come back to face the referendum, they gave him virtually nothing. And that's what the European Commission are like. They like all the powers to be vested too much in Europe and not enough in member states. And that is the problem, and that's why we are where we are. And I think it would be a nonsense for us to rerun. What I didn't want this report to be was a rerun of the referendum. And so therefore, as far as I'm concerned, for better or for worse, we are coming out of the EU. And my absolutely candid view on life is that the first 3 or 4 years, 5 years, are not going to be good. But 10 years down the road, we'll be damn glad we're out of it. And that's my honest view, because I think Europe... You see, you look at the growth in the world, and it's not in Europe. Now, I still want that access to that market. I still want to keep as much of that as we can. But I think ultimately the world will be outside. And I think the trouble is too with Europe, and I used to say to the European Commission, you don't need to involve yourself in that. Let the member states do it. Because you look at some of these votes that are going on across Europe, it's not very healthy that you've got the far right in Austria. You've got all sorts of people, that may or may not come to power in Italy. You've got, interesting, even though Macron's not far right, don't get me wrong, but all of a sudden you've got a president that had no political party, suddenly is the president of France. It's a fascinating world out there, but it's also quite a dangerous political world. And so I think you'll find my view is, like I said, given, but what we've got to do somehow or other, and this is what we're trying to do, practically as a select committee, because it's well beyond our pay grade as to what negotiated settlement we're going to get. But I think we've got to get ourselves out of the EU and get ourselves over those first hurdles. And I think once we're over them, I don't think the world's going to be that bleak at all. In fact, I think it's probably going to be better. But and I still don't think that Europe will in the end. They might huff and they might puff, and they'll say, we'll make those blasted Brits pay. But don't forget, I don't think nobody's actually said today, we still buy £65 billion more from the EU than they buy from us. Now, I'm sorry, if I was a European, whether I was cross whether Britain was leaving or not, I might be a little bit more worried that I might hit me in my own pocket. And I still think they won't necessarily make it that bad for us in the end. But you see, during negotiation, you'll have all sorts of things said, all sorts of positions taken, and I think that's where we are. And I thought these negotiations were going to be difficult, but my God, I didn't think they were going to be as difficult as this.
Angela, did
All
you?
I'll say, Nick, is look that I think we often forget I'm not going to rehearse the Brexit Remain argument, and I'm at risk of doing that by responding to what Neil's just said, and I'm not going to do that. I just think we need to remember as well, it's not just about the relationship we have with the European Union, 27 member states at the moment. It's also all the agreements that the European Union has across the world in terms of trade, and I think there's about 60 of them.
Yeah, wow.
And so the challenge before us is enormous. And what really worries me about that situation is that, talk about instability in Europe, we've got President Trump to deal with, frankly. We've got dictatorship in China. We have the Russian bear growling and threatening all its neighbours on a regular basis and invading some of them. So the world is a dangerous place. That's not a reason to hide behind what we have at the moment, but I do worry that the process of rebuilding that relationship with the European Union and those other 60 states that we have agreements with currently is going to detract enormously from the work that we need to do to remain competitive in an unstable world. It is going to change rapidly in the next decade or so. And I think we're at real risk of being diverted from the task of improving productivity, improving economic growth and getting out there and exporting our goods. And it really frustrates me that whether or not we can or cannot do deals is the question, rather than how do we improve productivity, how do we go out there, and how do we trade across the globe.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a very good point. And in particular, the one about the current preferential agreements we have as a member of the EU, making sure that those continue to apply on the day we leave. And I think sometimes the focus on these shiny new deals that don't exist yet is detracting from actually what's very, very important, which is maintaining our current levels of access. Right, I've got Ali here, and then there's somebody at the back. We've got a pocket down here after that, and then there's a few more. So let's keep going.
Thanks, Nick. Ali Kappa, Chair of the Horticulture and Potatoes Board, all fruit and veg, plants and flowers. I represent a sector, I've got members bouncing up and down around me, that farms on 3% of the UK farmed area and delivers 23% of the UK farm gate value. And I'm afraid there was a bit of a glaring omission in the slides. You did have potatoes on there, but you didn't have much about fruit and veg, plants and flowers. Just to help you a little bit, we have a high level of import from both within and outside of the EU, so I agree about the preferential trade deals. We have little export. There is a bit, actually, hops is an exception. It is critical, though, that we have the ability to move material across borders, perishable material. We don't have a British strawberry industry or a British apple industry without the plants and the trees to support those industries. And we don't have much in the way of out-of-season fresh produce without the ability to import that from other countries. So it's really critical that we start to see the impact for our sector in your report, if I may ask for that. And I would say that our sector would say that the biggest opportunity would be for some import substitution, because the levels of self-sufficiency for our sector, like many others, have been on the decline. And there is a big opportunity there for us to grow more here. But that does mean that we need to get the sector, which I know what your problem is. Your problem is DEFRA data, but we need to get the sector much higher up your agenda, please.
Thank you. And there's a question at the back.
Robert Gooch, British Free Range Egg Producers Association. Neil and Angela, I see that you've had a lot of correspondence with the Secretary of State about the lack of or the detail of the scenarios for the impact analyses for different sectors in the past. I believe you've got sight of a broader economic analysis for the whole economy, but we're not allowed to see that. And so my question to you is that true, and what do you think about it? Secondly, do you think there is a detailed economic impact analysis for agriculture sitting in some Whitehall shelf? And thirdly, perhaps why didn't you do that as part of your report, as no one else seems to be doing one? Thanks.
Right. Okay. Do you want to do those two?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, as far as horticulture is concerned, we did take evidence. I don't think DEFRA does give horticulture enough of a say. And I think Andrew and I agree entirely on this, because we've been to sort of various dinners with horticulture. So it's not only like your vegetables, your fruit, it's also about ornamental shrubs and flowers and all sorts. I mean, trees, there's everything there that we can do more of. And I think you're absolutely right when it's export substitution is where I think there's a big driving for horticulture. And I think what I will promise you to do, and Angela will hold me to it, is that as we look at the agriculture bill as it comes through, if there's not enough in it on horticulture, then we'll make sure there is in our report when we analyse it. And then as far as, yes, as the impact assessments, there are some, but they're not detailed. And so we have got a certain amount of access to it as MPs. We will be, as I said to you, we are now meeting with the Permanent Secretary, Claire Moriarty. And this is what Andrew and I can take it hot from this meeting, really, is the importance to have this sector by sector proper analysis. And it needs to be done now. I mean, there's been the AHDB has done quite a lot on the meat side. There's been various organisations have been doing bits and pieces and good work as well. But I think it's having that structure in place. And I said earlier, there's quite a lot more. I think something like 600 or 700 extra staff in DEFRA, so it'd be quite nice to know what they're doing, are part of these staff actually looking directly at the impact assessments? I would hope they are, but that's the sort of detailed questions we're going to ask. So, and like the trouble we've got with all reports we do, and we've got very good team, like I said, with Elliot and Anwin here, and we've got what 8 or 10 altogether, is it in
No, only 5, Chairman.
Only 5.
Bless you for thinking we count.
Yeah,
as 2,
seems like more like 10. But
yes.
It's having enough people to do the work that we do. But like I said, we are more than happy to try and take on some of this. And of course, don't forget, the NFU here, all your professional staff provide us with some really good stuff as well. I know I would say that because I'm sitting at the NFU table, but seriously, it's from the CLA, it's from all the Sheep Association, all these people that are out there. And from poultry, pigs, everything is to try and get as much information as we can. And I think your question is, is DEFRA collating it? Have they got an impact assessment on each sector? And that's what we need to find out, basically.
Okay. Charles at the back, and then we've got a question up at the front. Lots of hands still going up. So,
all I was going to say, Neil, we roughly know where we're going to be, don't we, when we come to March the 29th, 2019, because we're going to absorb all their rules into our legislation. They'll still have all those rules, so we're all level. We're a level playing field there. So I don't see we'll fall out with them there. What I believe then is we'll probably drift apart, and you're probably right. In 5-10 years' time, we'll be different, but we'll still have to have their rules when we're trading. Because I believe when you look at negotiations, David Davis is now talking about everybody's drifting together, and I think by the time we get there, the one thing that I would say is our sticking point, I believe, is going to be money. I think the EU will be looking for money. I went to a conference where the finance commissioner spoke, and their loss of income to the common agricultural policy by us pulling out is 14 billion euros. And I think that's where we'll be falling out with them, not on the rules, not on the trade, not all the other things, but over the money they're going to charge us to stay with those rules.
Right.
So I don't know whether you agree. And the other thing I will just say to you is that the chicken that come from America, even though they've been washed with chlorine, still have a damn sight more bugs on than mine do, which aren't washed with chlorine. Thank you.
I knew that, Charles, for a fact.
I mean, on that point on regulation, we'll come to the second question in a minute, but you made a very good point, I thought, in the report about regulatory alignment, where you quoted the Institute for Government, who said there's a difference between having the same rules and having those rules legally recognised as being the same as the EU's. And I think it's another thing we need to bear in mind. Just because we have the same rules at the moment, if the EU doesn't recognise that we have those, then that's when you start getting friction and extra burdens, because even if you're abiding by those rules, the EU will need to satisfy themselves that you're doing that and come and check. So it's an important point. Sometimes
it's like a divorce. You see, it's all right until the lawyers get involved. And I'm being absolutely serious now, because there'll be lawyers on both sides that'll look at everything. And Charles makes a really interesting point. If you are right, Charles, and it is about money, we can settle it. Because if it is about money, there'll be a negotiation in the end. And if we are, if they in the end we say, right, okay, that's the money we want. If we walk away, you don't get any of that money, then a deal can be had. It'll be an interesting one. But, if you're right in that, I think a deal will be got. Because, you see, don't forget, if we pull out, it leaves the Germans then as the total, virtually the total, not completely the total paymaster general of Europe, and they will want to share some of that responsibility. And so that's why I think that a deal can be done, because the money, yes, it's sticking. And yes, you see, the other issue will be, Charles, on the money is that, if we pay enough, we probably get a deal. For half of our population, it'll be too much if we pay them a penny. And that is the other sticking point politically, because we're not buying a farm or selling a house. It's not a private negotiation. You've got all political opinion and politics and everything mixed in. It's the worst time and place to do a deal, but a deal needs to be done. Yeah, go on.
Quickly, Charles.
We will honour our agreement.
Yeah.
But we have to pay Neil Kinnock and Dennis pensions until they die and all these sort of things. So the money that we pay will only be to be dressed up to actually honouring the agreement, as the Prime Minister always said we'll do.
Thank you, Charles.
I think we do have to honour our agreements that we've had in place, but what we don't want to be doing is charge too much money for future EU expenditure, and I think that's what the argument will be down to in the end.
Right, we've got about 15 minutes or so for continued questions. So, are you going to have to?
I have to go.
So
you've got to go and catch your train, have
I've
you?
got to catch a train.
Yeah,
I'm
sure
really
Neil's got answers enough for both of you in the meantime.
I like to have somebody to have a debate with. You see,
I know,
that's
exactly.
Right. Yeah. So thank you, Angela. Thank you, Angela, very much. Thank you very much.
I'm really sorry to have to go, actually. Yeah, thank you.
Roger Richards, NFU Dairy Advisor. Two quick questions. One of the recommendations of the EFRA report was bringing in production labelling. I know this is something Compassion in Wool Farming have pushed for, but how would this look for the dairy industry? It's something members have already expressed concerns about, particularly with the debate over graze versus indoor systems and consumer misconceptions about welfare and environmental standards. And secondly, with the UK's sheep food policy, should we be focusing on consuming more lower value British product or accessing higher value markets elsewhere?
Interesting one. Yeah. Is there another one?
Yes, Carl.
Carl Schneider, Farmers Weekly. In your report, you call for funding for farmers to help them through the transition period and to help them prepare for the post-Brexit world. Can you say a bit more about what you'd like to see that money spent on? And are you getting a feel that the door's ajar or open on that, or is that going to be a tough one?
Right. Okay. As far as the sort of type of production labelling, yes, I think there is. This is one where we have to be careful, because I think there is an argument that there'll be part of the population that likes grass-fed beef, grass-fed lamb, grass-fed milk production, and cows grazed in the field, and I think that's a lot of what the public like to see. But counter to that, of course, you've still got very good animal welfare standards in large production that may be zero grazed. So it's getting the sort of type of production and the quality right. But I think certainly that's a political, or not a party political, but it's a political move of where I believe the country to be. Now, what was the second part of your question?
The second question was about the UK's cheap food policy, and should we be focusing on lower value products here or accessing higher value markets elsewhere?
Well, I mean, the simple answer is both, because my view is that I've got a sort of very old-fashioned view of economics, and that is that if you've got a dairy market, you you get you get as much of your home market as you can, and then you export as much as you can. You keep the market tight, and you get a good price. The moment you've got too much milk and not enough market, that's when you get your low price. And so I think it is a combination of both, because I still think our consumers want to have a good product. I don't say it should be low priced, but I think it should be a reasonable price, home market, and then the higher end. It's like you've got tourist businesses and people out there who can sell to the tourists and can mark up their food and get a really good price. That takes a certain percentage of the market each time. It's not the be all and end all. It doesn't. Still, 90% of the food will go through the major processors and retailers. But every time you take a percentage, so if you take another percentage or two of milk, turn it into high-value yogurts or cheeses or whatever, and you export it to China, you take another 2 or 3% out of the total market. Because in the end, it's only those last few percentage points that are either you've got overproduction or underproduction that makes the difference between a good price and a bad one. So I think it very much is a case of doing that. And I think your question really is, it is partly on research and development, it's partly on we're trying to tease out, because George Eustace has been talking a lot about how we create a productive farming in the future. So will it be more grants towards buildings? Will it, when we talk about the environment, a lot of slurry stores have already been covered, but do we want to cover more of that? Do we actually want to sort of help farmers be competitive by giving them help to actually alter their farming practices as well? So it's a combination of all those things. I mean, in the future, and this is probably controversial even in this room, do we need to look towards sort of biotechnology and GM and all those things? But of course we could have a big debate in this room alone on it, let alone in the population. But I mean, there could be an argument in the future with blight-resistant potatoes and others that there could be a benefit to actually using some GM technology. But I better not open that debate up, because we'll be here all
We'll have to have
day.
another breakout session.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right, I've got 3 questions down in the corner here. Yes.
Just very quickly, Phil Allen from the Southwest. Sorry to bring up this subject, and probably many of you will groan when I mention the word TB. But seeing as the NFU has put 10 million into this project up to now, I do appreciate all your contributions, and that's why I'm going to ask this question. Neil, we talk about high animal welfare status in this country as if it's a given. The one thing we haven't got high status on is our TB position. Does that present as a risk? And does that present as a risk that may make some of these discussions academic?
Thank you.
Right.
Alex, and then if you pass it as well.
Alex Waugh, I'm from the Flour... Excuse me. From the Flour Millers Association. Neil, in your report there's a brief section on Northern Ireland, mostly to do with cross-border trade in animals and so on. Ireland's our biggest market for flour. We supply 80% of the flour they consume there. And I'm interested in your views on the fail-safe agreement that effectively says if we don't reach an agreement with Ireland, then we're going to keep everything the same and we'll make sure the rules are the same so we can carry on more or less in a customs union. Does that mean that there's kind of an incentive on the other side not to reach an agreement, because then we'll end up with a customs agreement, which is what they want anyway?
Right, okay.
Well, one more. We'll just take a third one now, because
Yeah.
we've got the microphone there.
Philip Wilkinson from the British poultry industry. I chair the export group. I'm also vice president of the European Poultry Association. Firstly, I'd just make a comment with regard to my colleague from the CLA behind, with regard to German cars and them finding an alternative arrangement. Can I just say they're spending a lot of time in Brussels. I think that deal is virtually being done with Mercosur. Sandro Galliano has done the deal where cars will be traded for more food coming in from Mercosur into the EU. And just to put it into perspective as to how food is held in terms of esteem there, Commissioner Hogan wasn't even involved in those discussions. So I think that is a deal that is partly going to bridge that gap. The second point that I want to make, Chairman, is this, and it's with regard to the help that governments can give in terms of export. We export in our business over £63 million worth of products a year. A lot of that going into South Africa. In the campaign for Brexit, it was suggested that a lot of the third world countries, the developing countries, will be the market, and I totally agree with that. We've already started to make inroads there, and at any one time we've got 45 containers of chicken on the ocean going to Durban, South Africa. Only in recent weeks, and I've shared this with you and written to the Secretary of State, they have slapped a 37% tariff on safeguarding product going into South Africa. That's 37 on top of a 23% anti-dumping tariff. Nobody is out there, Neil, with open arms saying, where have you been all our lives? Send us loads of it and we'll pay you shed loads of money for it. We need the sort of help that you alluded to with the Dutch, with people out there in China, in South Africa, in Pretoria, helping us. We've got operations in Holland. They help us. They really do. And the same in Poland. We need that sort of support. We will rise to the challenge. We will export the product, but we need as much help in return.
Great, right,
Thank you.
okay.
So you got
Right.
TB Ireland.
TB, I mean, I think the straight answer to you on TB is yes, if we don't sort it, it could come an issue, because don't forget, I went to the European Parliament in 1999. I marched down the Champs-Élysées telling them to eat British beef, because even under single market rules, the French were still not allowing British beef in. So, you know, we've got to get our disease under control, and that's why, you know, I really welcome what the Secretary of State has now said on TB, because I was a bit worried where he was going on it. But I think, you know, he realises we need to keep those culls going, do it, you know, in a very welfare friendly way, but actually sort this situation out, which needs dealing with. So I think we must get our disease under control. So it is an issue that and I think, provided we are seen to be getting on top of it, seen to be actually really focusing on it, then I don't think it becomes a trade issue. If we were to take our eye off the ball on it, then I think it could become a trade issue. So we need to get it sorted and keep going. Northern Ireland, you see, I think the politics of Northern Ireland is that I think it's an issue where I think will help us get a deal overall with the EU and Great Britain. I don't think you can have a different deal in Ireland than you can in the rest of the United Kingdom, because Northern Ireland will never accept it, you see. The point I was making was that I think, do the EU, you know, America will be watching on this as well, because they won't want, you know, further troubles in Northern Ireland, so and in Ireland, and so there's a lot of politics that on security and on the history of Ireland that focuses, you know, not only Britain, the EU, but also America. And so I think this is where there will be huge political force saying, for God's sake, don't create a hard border between the North and South. And so that's why I think it'll help us get a deal overall. But do I think it's going to be a different deal in Northern Ireland and the Republic? No, I don't actually. But I think, you know, it'll help us get a deal for overall with the EU. And then, yes, I think, you know, you couldn't hit the nail more on the head. There's no, you know, I always say that, you know, there's trade deals that can be had out there, but we want a good trade deal, but so do they. And so they're always looking to get that good trade deal. So if we're going to get these good trade deals that are good for us, we've got to up our game. We've got to have the people over there, and we've got to make sure, you know, all of our vets, everybody, all of our systems in place for licensing the export. Not only have we got to get the market, when the Chinese or others come to inspect our slaughterhouses, all of those things, because as you know, they do it all, and they go into a huge amount of detail. And yes, you can get food into China, but my God, can't they be difficult in the process? And, you know, let's open our eyes and say, yes, we can get these deals, but we have got to fight for them, and we've got to fight with, you know, I mean, the Europeans, Denmark and Holland in particular, and Germany and I mean France are all doing very, very good deals now. So like I said, I'm not saying we can't do them, but like I said, let's be absolutely sure that we got our eyes open and we go in there and fight our corner. And I was quite serious, and I know you said there's a job for the House of Lords, but I do actually think if you've got trade envoys in that can go, and build up a relationship in a country, and they don't change every 5 minutes because the cabinet's been reshuffled or whatever, I think that's the way you get trade deals, and I think that's what I think. I do want to keep the House of Lords well, and if I can finish off a few of them, it'll make space for me later on. You see, but no, I didn't say that, did I? But no, seriously, it's a case of making sure we've got somebody of status that can follow, because the developing countries and the Far East, they really respect the longevity of office, and in our Commons position, everybody gets recycled and changed very, very quickly, and I don't think they understand that.
Okay, Abby, and then there's one at the back on the right.
Abby Kay, Farmers Guardian.
Hello, Abby.
Hi. I'd be quite interested in an answer to Carl's question, actually, about the Brexit Adaptation Fund. But also, I'd like to know why Liam Fox didn't give evidence to your inquiry. I would have quite liked to see you hold his feet to the fire on things like the rollover of the EU's trade agreements with third countries and tariff rate quotas and whatnot.
Yeah, but I think it was in the end.
Take one more. There's the
yeah.
microphone's at the back. There we go.
We are planning to take.
Sorry.
We are planning to take over Fox.
Yep.
Yeah.
Anthony Snell, soft fruit grower from Herefordshire, Horticultural Board. The aim of any committee is to debate and come to conclusions, but Angela has actually just left, but she says that the Prime Minister needs to say what she wants and give direction. But surely your role as a committee is to come to proper conclusions and and advise what's best for our the agricultural sector. And in this we've had a very interesting discussion here, but we haven't heard one sort of conclusion. So Neil, be very interested to hear what you think is the answer for British agriculture, and also in answer to Ali Kappa's horticultural question, you said that you talked about what we needed was export substitution. Surely you meant import substitution.
Yeah, import, sorry. Yeah. I beg your pardon on that one.
Okay.
Right. Yes, Abby, yours was you were asking. Just remind me, please. Yes, Liam Fox he is still down to come to the committee, so we haven't got him yet, but he's coming. So we don't know exactly when, do we?
No, he's suspiciously quiet.
Yes, that's right. Because funny enough, I went to a sort of private meeting with him where he was making much of the fact, he'd done a deal on the New Zealand lamb and splitting up the quotas, and then only to find that it was sort of being challenged by other members of the WTO. So, I think he does realise the necessity of a trade deal, especially on agriculture. And I think, you are right, and it'd be essential to actually get him before us to see where he sees that go. Because you see, the trouble is the rhetoric is very much, open up the trade is good, but not if it's going to undermine your own production. And I think that's where we want that reassurance. And I think that's what we'll be looking for Liam Fox to give us. So yes, that will be there. Do you want to ask me what Neil Parish's view on agriculture is? Because I can go on all afternoon.
We've got about 3 minutes
on that one. But no, I think what we did is we took each sector and we gave an analysis of exactly the effects of it. So I think our recommendation perhaps may not be quite as clear as you'd like, but really is that the access to the European market is essential. There is 60% of our food exports and imports are coming from that direction, and we need to retain access to that. But we didn't go down the route of saying it must be through the single market and the customs union. We gave the government the option of either going that route or actually having a bespoke agreement. But I think that, the final point is it's easier for a select committee, and dare I say, and I would say this even if Angela was here, easier for the opposition to say, well, government must have this deal and they must have it today. Where I do accept, as a political party, there's far too many senior members of cabinet and across the party having too many individual ideas on where we want this deal to be. If we were more united, I think we've got better chance of getting that deal. But I still think we will get it. But it's not, I'd love to think it was my role, to dictate to the Prime Minister and the Cabinet exactly what sort of deal they've got to have. But I think that's well beyond my pay grade. But I can assure you that privately, there are many of us that are saying, for God's sake, stop all this squabbling and let's get on with it. Because I think then we've got a real chance of getting a deal. Because the trouble is, at the moment, we are seen as too divided, and that then is not good when you're negotiating. But is it easy to get everybody in the room together to agree it? No. But I still think we can achieve it. But farming always was and always will be. The coming out of the European Union was always going to affect agriculture. Because of the common agricultural policy, whether you loved or whether you hated it, it was always going to affect. Our trade policy was going to affect agriculture. This is what we're doing. We're going to, like I said, when we finish this one now, we are getting the white paper will come in on agriculture, first on fish and then on agriculture. We will then look at those. We will look at what the government's proposing. We will then look at payments. We will look at welfare, all of these things, environment, everything that's been talked about, today by the Secretary of State. All of that will be looked at, and then we will link that into what's happened, we believe, over trade. So, I think it was a logical thing to do, and I also say I appreciate a great audience I've had this afternoon, and also the fact that you asked some very good and searching questions. You've got some answers. You probably haven't got all of the answers.
I've got three more for you.
Right?
So
okay,
we've got literally 2 minutes. So if you can make them as quick as possible, Peter, Anthony, and we've got one.
Peter Gadd, cereal grower in the East Midlands. Neil, notwithstanding what you just said in your previous answer, and you almost alluded to it earlier on in the afternoon by talking about an interim deal. Do you feel there's an opportunity to try and overcome this potential impasse on Brexit Day by having some form of graduated transitional deal whereby all parties can work towards what they want to achieve, both Europe, over here in Britain, while still allowing us to go out into develop new deals around the rest of the world and also encompass some of the EU arrangements that we have at the moment?
Okay. Over here, and then... Yes,
Mr. Chairman, mine's just a comment. To be fair, Neil there is our MP for Tiverton. Over the past few years, he and I find it hard to pass compliments. Anyone who knows me, he's worked tirelessly for us. He's not only our MP, he's now become a friend of both mine and Sally's, and he spends an awful lot of time fighting on our cause. And like I said, I find it difficult to give compliments, but he's the best we got, I'll tell you that now. Thank
you. Final question, quickly, Anthony. Yeah.
Anthony Root. Yes, as a dairy producer, I supply a European co-op, Arla. You touched earlier on about how we could short our market to increase our value out of dairy products. How is being a member of a European co-op going to help me going forward, please?
I'll do it in reverse order. Arla, I see, is buying out Yo Valley, aren't they? Is that right? That's interesting, because that then means they've got an even bigger presence here in Britain. I mean, I think that Arla obviously have got confidence in the fact that they are going to be able to trade in Britain across Europe, aren't they? Otherwise, they wouldn't be buying, in my view, Yeo Valley Farms organics. And so, therefore, I think I know we had Christensen in to see us, and he said, during the milk crisis that you mustn't actually reduce production, you must increase it, because all you do is just allow more imports in if you decrease your production. It's an interesting argument. If everybody in the world does it, it doesn't necessarily work. But I can understand his argument. So I think Arla, and again we will when we do the Ag Bill, Arla will be on the top of our list to come have them in, because I think they're very interesting, because the fact that they've got, I think, something like 90% of Danish milk, 60% of Swedish milk. They're massive, aren't they, across the whole of the EU, and so, like I said, I think they are very interesting. So yeah, we'll be looking at that. But they've obviously got confidence. And then I'll do it in reverse order. Then Colin, I don't know, it's difficult to answer that one, but all I know is that Colin is he's a great friend, and also he tells you how it is. So hopefully he might have got it right on this occasion. But seriously, I do my damnedest to have a go, and I am seen in Parliament. Well, that's that bastard parish on farming again. But I think they have a reasonable amount of confidence. I might understand a little bit I'm talking about, so that's quite useful. And then on the final one on the deal, I think there's every chance there'll be an interim deal. But you raise the interesting point. I think the sticking point is, you see, if you have an interim deal, and at the same time you can negotiate deals with bringing in, a trade deal, for argument's sake, with America. I suppose the interesting thing is if you were then bringing in food from America, processing it here, and then trying to send it into a European market. Now, I suspect that's not going to happen, for the simple reason that I think a trade deal with America may not be a million years away, but I don't think it's going to be in that interim period. And so I think what I'm hoping we will get to a stage that we'll be able to agree an interim deal with Europe. We'll be able to open up negotiations on trade deals with the rest of the world, and then we can sign those off as we leave that interim deal. I mean, that would be logical, wouldn't it? But I mean, politics and everything else, and Europe and Britain and Whitehall and the European Commission, perhaps logic is not always there, but that's where we would like to be. So I am again an optimist. I think that's where we can get, but there'll have to be flexibility on both sides. And of course, the argument's been had today. Is there flexibility on the European side? Is there enough flexibility on our side? It's an interesting one, but I think in the end, a deal must be done, because I think what people will want, won't they, is they'll want good quality food to very high standards on their being able to buy that. And I think they do actually want to buy British food. And I think that is a bonus. And I talked about it earlier on. This Brand Britain, I think, and I know it sounds a bit like a sort of Tony Blair slogan, doesn't it? Brand Britain, or Cool Britannia. But seriously, I think that is something that we can market so well in the future. And I think we mustn't. This report, I know it's got it's bound to have a deal of pessimism in it, because various deals will affect the industries badly. But we've got to then try and take this, create some positive ways forward, and that can be done. And so therefore, I don't want you going away from here today too depressed, because I do think we've still got some time. I do think some sort of interim deal will be arrived at, and I think that it'll be a few years down the road when we are completely out of the EU, but that's where I believe we are going, because I don't think we are going to reverse the decision. And so therefore I think, you know, we've got to work out the way forward, and I think it can be done. And like I said, again, thank you very much for some very searching questions this afternoon. I'm glad I had Angela here with me, because you can see what is useful on the Select Committee is that especially with Angela there, we have a fairly good sort of sound voice of Labour, and so I've got no majority on the committee, and so therefore it's good if you've got a reasonable relationship. And also, if you've got a cross-party report, it's easier to get that, you know, get some sort of traction behind it as well. So,
well, thank you for that, Neil. It was an extraordinary tour de force.